Hi there, are you little Johnny? Yes, Doc. Hi, this is my son. Okay, great. How are you feeling today, Johnny? How is he feeling? First of all, can we maybe not hyperfixate on his emotions? Do you not know how harmful that is? Excuse me, ma'am. I was actually talking to Johnny right there. Well, I'm his mother. I know best. Okay. So, Johnny, I understand you broke your wrist. Can you tell me a little bit about how that happened? I can answer that for him. Actually, you know what, Mom? I would love to get just a little bit of privacy to speak to Johnny one-on-one, if that's all right with you. You know, just to hear it in his words and give him a little bit of a questionnaire. Would that be okay? So one of you guys asked me to look into this book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up by Abigail Shrier, and I was curious about the concept. I went into it with an open mind, and boy, am I sorry I did. The thesis can kind of be summarized as Gen Z is super mentally ill and it's therapist's fault. And that's actually not even an exaggeration. As you can see from the synopsis itself, it says Gen Z's mental health is worse than that of previous generations. Abigail Shrier argues that the problem isn't the kids, it's the mental health experts. She reveals that most of the therapeutic approaches have serious side effects and few proven benefits. So let's talk about it. So the way that this video is structured, first and foremost, I'm going to run through the book kind of chapter by chapter, give my reactions to some of what she says. Then I'm going to break down points that I agreed with of this book, points I disagreed with on this book, and why I think it's an incredibly intellectually dishonest book, including the evidence she misinterpreted and the evidence she conveniently left out because it didn't support her thesis. So the author of this book is Abigail Shrier, a former opinion columnist who has a law degree, and she also wrote Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. Now, I won't be commenting on Abigail's political viewpoints or her former book. I'm going to kind of take this book for what its content is. I only mention that background because when I read a nonfiction book, I like to know who the author is. I like to know what qualifications they have to speak on that subject and also any biases they might hold. So if you don't know me, you might be thinking, okay, well, what credentials and biases do you hold? And that would be a fair question. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, a master's in clinical psychology, a bachelor's of arts in psychology with a minor in anthropology. As you can imagine, I spent a decade of my life training in liberal institutions, so that is a lens that greatly shaped me, although I will say that in the past year or so, I've drifted greatly from any political ideology. I actually don't consider myself a liberal anymore. That's a conversation for another time. The point is that I make up my opinion about each topic at hand. Before we get into it, I'm anticipating this is going to be a very long video, so if you enjoy it, please give a like, comment what your thoughts are, share it with a friend who might enjoy it. It really does go so far to help this channel so that I can continue to make videos like this for you. With that said, lean back, get yourself a blanket and a cup of tea, and let me take you on a journey. The introduction starts with Abigail giving an anecdote about when she took her son to the pediatric urgent care clinic because he's had a stomach ache. And she talks about how in came a man and said, "Would you mind giving us some privacy so that I can do our mental health screening?" And that she was shocked that the privacy he wanted was from her. Since Abigail is very shocked that this would happen, I actually have a pretty good explanation for why it did. Somatic symptoms like stomach aches severe enough to warrant a visit to urgent care can sometimes reflect something like inner turmoil or trauma. Given that the vast majority of kids experience abuse at the hands of their own family members, then it becomes pretty important to be able to screen for those things without the family members present. And even if it's not an issue of trauma, a kid might not feel comfortable disclosing what's going on in their mind with a parent present because they feel embarrassed or they don't know how the parent's going to take it or all sorts of reasons. Now, I'm guessing this particular urgent care had some sort of screening determination that if a kid comes in with an unexplained somatic symptom, you do a quick mental health screening to cover your bases. Unfortunately, this is the world that we live in, where a lot of institutions and a lot of providers feel that they need to be very, very proactive about screening against risk because they don't want to miss something really important and they don't want to get in trouble themselves. I think you can understand why prioritizing a kid's potential safety is more important than offending the parent. Now, she asked to actually look at this person's questionnaire, and I will admit the questions are pretty terrible and very leading. I don't think I can say what they are because they're very related to unaliving, and I don't want for this video to get demonetized. But it is pretty clear that this is a questionnaire meant to cover the institution's liability and not necessarily to get a sense of what's going on with the kid. So I agree, terrible questionnaire, but it's there for a reason. And then she goes on to talk about how her generation thought they were doing so much better at raising kids without spanking and things like that. And how did it come to be that her generation raised a generation of kids that disclosed so much more trauma and disclosed so much more mental illness, and who even declared that they don't want kids of their own. Apparently that is something very problematic for Abigail. She talks about how in this day and age, everything that used to be normal is now considered a diagnosis. Like shyness is now social anxiety disorder, being a disruptive student is now ADHD, and I actually do agree that we are over-diagnosing kids, though again, the reason for this is largely due to systemic factors, like insurance companies demanding a diagnosis in order to cover treatment. And then she introduces one of the main pieces of her issue with modern-day therapy, which is that modern-day therapists think that everybody needs therapy because everyone's a little bit broken, and she takes issue with this. To this I say, wellness is more than just the absence of disease. Wellness to me means a person living in alignment with their values, experiencing joy and gratitude, experiencing connection with the people around them, feeling like they have power to execute the things that they want in their life, being in a state of flow very regularly in their life. That's to me what wellness is. Wellness is not just the absence of a diagnosis. So somebody could be not well while also not having a diagnosis, and mental health treatment can absolutely help that person achieve that wellness. Then in chapter 1, she goes into iatrogenesis, which is the side effects of something that's meant to be a treatment. She describes her own experiences with therapy and proposes the idea that while adults can challenge and push back on their therapist's interpretations, kids don't have that same ability because of the power imbalance. And this to me doesn't quite make sense because kids have a power imbalance with any sort of adult, and also because therapists actually make a lot of strides in trying to even out those power imbalances. That's not to say that it's always even, but therapists are actually trained in making the client know, even if the client is a child, that they have equal footing and that they can vocalize what they need. Abigail seems to be very preoccupied with kids possibly being influenced by adults other than herself. So she goes into her theory about how when we send people to therapy that don't actually have a severe mental illness, that it actually does more harm than good. She says you wouldn't get an x-ray unless you needed one, but an x-ray, as we know, could actually create cancer if exposed to it long term. So possible carcinogen compared to somebody providing a mental health service, a little bit different. She says, just maybe don't send your kids off to therapy unless they absolutely require it. Which to me is kind of like saying, don't take your kid for an annual checkup at the primary care physician unless they seem to be unhealthy. She says that any intervention strong enough to cure a person is also strong enough to hurt them. And while this is true, therapy as a whole is not an intervention. Therapy is made up of different types of therapy, and those different types of therapy are made up of a lot of different interventions. It's not all one intervention. When people go to a therapist, first the therapist assesses, is this a good fit? Does your presenting concern, does your particular personality fit in with the type of therapy that I provide? And if not, they refer out. And then the intervention is tailored to the patient. An aggressive patient isn't going to get, for instance, assertiveness training. A shy one, a passive person, might get assertiveness training. It's not like therapy is this one-size-fits-all intervention that gets put onto everybody and has the same possible effects on everybody. Then I thought this was interesting. She cites that therapy can make marital stress worse, person's resilience, can render a patient more traumatized, more depressed, lower their self-efficacy. And I looked at the reference she put for this claim because I was wondering, well, what are we talking about, long-term or short-term? Are we talking about like while therapy is still ongoing? Because sometimes people get worse before they get better. What type of treatment, what population, what age range are we talking about? I looked at the source. This article does list some possible negative side effects of therapy, but those are distress, worsening of symptoms, and strains in family relationships. And the study was done with people who had been seen for 10 plus sessions of CBT in particular. This is to be expected in therapy. It is expected that once you finally shine a light on the stuff that you've been avoiding, that it's going to get a little harder before you can move forward from it. It was also a lot more specific than the claim she's making. It's about one particular type of therapy in one study with one population.
Also, I just wanted to mention that the patients in the study were diagnosed with mild to moderate psychopathology, most commonly depression, anxiety, and personality disorders, with 43% of them having been hospitalized at least once. So if Abigail's claim is that people get negative iatrogenic effects from unnecessary therapy, this study does not support her argument at all. These were not people who went to therapy for no reason, and as we know, symptoms are bound to worsen during exposure therapy before they start to taper off.
She takes issue with the APA's claim that therapy helps people live more fulfilling lives by saying there is alas no proof that they accomplish any of that in aggregate. Which doesn't really make sense to me, because why would they need to accomplish that in aggregate? Like, do we ask all of medicine to prove the efficacy of all of medicine as a whole? No, we look at specific interventions for specific populations. There are specific types of therapy and specific interventions that are shown to be effective for specific presenting concerns. And therapists are well aware of what kinds of disorders do or don't work for the type of therapy that they provide. She sort of ends this chapter by saying that we would expect a population that is otherwise healthy, that has gone to mental health treatment unnecessarily, to have a lot of iatrogenic effects. So here we see sort of her thesis that Gen Z is mentally ill because they are having iatrogenic effects to therapy. This operates under the assumption that kids are being sent to therapy for no reason, when in reality, by the time somebody ends up in therapy, it is a very last resort for most cases. People don't want to go to therapy. They don't want to talk about the hard stuff. They don't want to pay somebody week after week. They only really go to therapy if they really have to, if they're in a lot of distress, or if somebody else says that it's impacting their life. But even if this were true, even if people were sending their kids to therapy for no reason at all, correlation does not equal causation. It's a very basic concept that, as we'll see later, Abigail is well aware of. And then chapter 2 is all about how therapy seems to be making kids worse. So she starts off with another anecdote about her interviewing a high school girl, and the girl is telling her that all her kids are mentally ill and have all these issues, and the therapy doesn't seem to be helping. My issue with this is that we don't know how that person would have been if they didn't have therapy. Therapy could be helping. Things could be a lot better now than if this kid did not have therapy. That's why when we look at the research, we look at overall trends between the control group and the treatment group. And also, something that a lot of people don't want to talk about is that not all diseases are curable, and this also applies for some mental illnesses. Some people are just going to struggle with a disorder for the rest of their life, and it's not a matter of curing it, but rather managing it. And you certainly wouldn't expect those people to have already cured it as teenagers when there are a whole host of different stressors and changes biologically, socially, familially, that are going to greatly stress that person. The fact that somebody isn't completely symptom-free doesn't mean that the therapy is not working. So this interviewee tells Abigail that there are two sets of friends in her circle: those who have very severe mental illness and those who are seeking explanations for their unhappiness. And Abigail disagreed with how this interviewee regarded the two on a spectrum, but they are a continuum. They're actually not a dichotomy. Every single mental health issue is on a continuum. It's not the type of thing where you either have it or you don't, or it's either severe or you have nothing at all. Is this something I really need to explain? She talks about how 42% of the current generation has a mental health diagnosis, which makes normal increasingly abnormal. And like I said, while I do agree that there is a lot of overdiagnosing of kids, particularly for insurance purposes, this might not be as unusual as she's making it seem. When you think about the fact that over 95% of the population has at least one health concern, a third of them have 5 or more ailments, and 45% of them have a chronic illness, why is it unusual that a lot of people would also have mental health struggles? The mind is a part of the body, and when we act like mental illness is so much worse than physical illness, we are stigmatizing mental illness. We are acting like this is something that should be extremely rare because it's so terrible, when in reality it's something that most people struggle with at some point in their life. Mental diagnoses are not a reflection of somebody's character. Then she talks about something called the treatment prevalence paradox, where she says that therapists are no longer happy just treating the ill, and now they want to support the healthy. Again, I feel like I can offer some insight on this. It's called preventative care. It targets people at the prevention stage before things get so bad that they get in a lot of distress and it's even more of a financial burden on their families and the industry. It's actually considered a very effective way to prevent mental illness from getting worse. But then in the next paragraph, she talks about preventative care in the context of medical illnesses. So she definitely has heard of it, but she doesn't really point out the discrepancy in what she's saying, that preventative care is okay for medical illnesses, but not for mental ones. It just goes right into, as treatments for anxiety and depression have become more sophisticated and readily available, adolescent anxiety and depression have ballooned. Again, seemingly inferring causality there. Later in the chapter, she acknowledges that it could just be a coincidence. It doesn't necessarily imply causality, but it is peculiar, in her words. She says it might provide a clue that the treatments aren't actually helping. So it kind of sounds like she's saying, yes, correlation does not always equal causation, but it could be. It's peculiar, isn't it? She acknowledges that most therapists would probably say she has the causality reversed, that people are mentally ill in greater quantities or are more open about their mental illness, and that this results in more people seeking therapy. And she says that from her interviews with therapists, when she's asked them why are people getting more mentally ill, the things they usually point to are smartphones, the pandemic, and climate change. I would also add in there economic instability and also unhealthy lifestyles. I think those also play a huge role. So then she takes each of these three things one by one, and she basically makes the case that all three of them are actually therapists' fault, because therapists are not telling parents to set limits around technology with their kids. Says who?
Why you always lying?
Because therapists should have advocated for public health policy during the pandemic, basically to tell the CDC to send kids back to school. And because therapists are telling kids they need to catastrophize about climate change and not challenging those cognitions. And I get it, the book needed a good villain in order to get its readers riled up. It follows the formula of fearmonger about something that's happening, and then you need a scapegoat to blame for what that's fearmongering about, and then you're going to present all of the evidence that supports your viewpoint and ignore all the one that doesn't. Let's take each of these one by one. So starting with the smartphone, she says that mental health experts embrace smartphone use, dismiss their impact on adolescents, offer seminars to teens and parents on responsible social media use, which she says is like drug counselors lecturing on the appropriate uses of drugs. That is a very insincere comparison. It's more like teaching safe driving or teaching safe sex than appropriate use of drugs. And I'm not sure where she heard that mental health experts are dismissing the negative effects of technology, considering there are countless studies coming out on this year after year after year. As for the pandemic, like I said, it's not really therapists' place to dictate public health policy, but these were discussions that we were definitely having within and outside of the therapy room, that the pandemic has caused a mental health crisis with adolescents. These are conversations that we are having, even if Abigail acts like they're not. And as for climate change, Abigail seems to be of the opinion that therapists should just tell kids they're exaggerating about the catastrophic effects of climate change. And she says that in her interviews with young people, none of them gave climate change as a reason for their emotional struggles, which that's great that that was her experience, but I can tell you that having worked with young people myself as a therapist, this is something that they bring up quite a lot. I used to work at a college counseling center where it was something that was being brought up quite a lot of fear around the world coming to an end, to the point where the school actually created a support group, a climate change grief support group. Now listen, I do agree that there is a little bit of fear-mongering around this issue, particularly because catastrophizing about it isn't going to help anything, and because if this is the way the world is headed, there's not much we can do about it, and I don't particularly believe in freaking out about something that we can't do anything about. But you can't just say that it's not a thing that's happening, because just because you haven't heard of it happening doesn't mean therapists haven't. She also talks about how kids these days are very pessimistic and have a very external locus of control. And I actually completely agree with this, and in fact, I've made videos about it multiple times, and I'll probably continue to talk about this issue because I think it is very problematic, which kind of disproves her point that therapists aren't talking about this and don't disagree with it. And then in chapter 3, we get to the good stuff, where she gives us the steps of bad therapy as she sees it. And she makes the very grand statement that, in fact, there's very little evidence that individual psychotherapy helps young kids at all, which is actually not true. Based on the CDC itself, parent training in behavior management works well for ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders, child behavior therapy works well for ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders, and CBT works well for disruptive behavior disorders, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. With all due respect, I trust the CDC a little bit more on this, but I did actually look at the references she cited, and I was actually surprised that it's not as effective as I expected it to be. And this is definitely cause for concern, but it might not be that much more different than it is for adults. Because relapse prevention is always a concern with any sort of therapy, and good therapy tries to prep clients to not fall into relapse after therapy is over, but of course things come up, and without support, there's always the risk of backtracking sometimes. And when that happens, it's not the end of the world. It might just be time for a checkup back at the therapist. But at the end of the day, we do know that working with the parents of kids is often more effective than working with the kids themselves. The issue becomes that a lot of parents just want to send their kids off to therapy, and when the therapist tells them, hey, actually, I'd love to work with you, or maybe you should see somebody, they're completely closed off from that. They don't want to actually get involved. It's kind of more of this fix my kid, he's the problem type of thing. In this chapter, Abigail praises one of the therapists she interviewed for disclosing the iatrogenic effects in a waiver to his therapy clients. She seems to think that this is just something that one random therapist did, when in reality, all therapists do this in informed consent forms. It's not called a waiver, it's called an informed consent. So, what are the steps of bad therapy? Well, step 1 is teach kids to pay attention to their feelings. Yeah, you heard that right. The first step of bad therapy is to get kids to pay attention to their feelings. Abigail literally thinks that asking somebody how they're feeling or teaching them to check in with their feelings is harmful. She loves to use the expression shake it off in a very invalidating manner, like just shake off the feeling that you have. But in reality, we know that avoidance of emotions, denial, and suppression of emotions makes things far worse. In fact, avoidance can actually be a compulsion with an anxiety and OCD issues. And in general, it's just like a beach ball. The harder you try to push it underwater to drown it, the harder it's going to pop back up. The issues aren't going to go away just because you want to ignore them. They're going to pop up in different areas of your life across time when it's harder to get rid of them. As we can see from this study on the role of avoidance of emotional material in anxiety disorders, emotional avoidance and thought suppression not only hinder the learning process and maintain anxious responding, but they also actually heighten anxious responding to threatening cues and interfere with emotion functionality, thereby further impeding adaptive responding. What about this other study on emotional avoidance, in which participants high in emotional avoidance responded with greater levels of anxiety and affective distress, though not physiological arousal? They also experienced greater levels of anxiety relative to the low emotional avoidance group when suppressing compared to observing their bodily sensations. Or what about this study that showed that high emotional avoidance and low social support predict the most severe depression? Or this one on how emotion suppression can make it worse when you're recounting a distressing memory? Or this one that showed that a personality that tends to be very suppressive in their negative emotions is at greater risk of large bowel cancer? But that was a pretty old study, so let's look at a more recent meta-analysis. This one from 2012 showed that repressive coping was linked to cancer and cardiovascular diseases, especially hypertension, adding to the literature that repressive coping could be very detrimental to one's physical health. Should I go on? Abigail points out that Americans think they should always be happy in this day and age, and I actually do agree with this, but most modern-day therapies acknowledge that this isn't the goal and isn't healthy, and they focus on meaning-making over happiness, which you would know if you were actually trained in this stuff. She discusses something called action orientation versus state orientation. She says that the research on this topic has shown that action orientation is more beneficial during performance, but she kind of seems to be stretching the topic by implying that it has any benefits for emotionality, when in fact emotional clarity, meaning having clarity on how you're feeling, has been shown to have a curvy linear relationship with internalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety, with neuroticism as the moderator. In other words, putting too much of a focus on your feelings can definitely be taken to an extreme. It's healthiest to be mindful of your emotions in moderate doses, not in low doses like she seems to be suggesting, and there is nothing particularly extreme about asking somebody how they're feeling that day. Then she says bad therapy step 2 is to induce rumination. She says that people just end up venting in therapy, and then this just gets them in a cycle of ruminating, which actually makes their mental health worse. This is not a typical thing that happens in therapy. Are there therapists out there that do just let people vent? Yeah, I'm sure there are. But when Abigail says bad therapy, it seems like she's stretching it to mean most therapy. Because, in her words, Abigail Shrier argues that the problem isn't the kids, it's the mental health experts. She reveals that most of the therapeutic approaches have serious side effects and few proven benefits. Bad therapy step 3 is to make happiness a goal but reward emotional suffering. Again, Therapists do not do this. Bad therapy step 4 is to affirm and accommodate kids' worries. She gives the example of a therapist that gives a kid a note so that they can get accommodations on a test. Again, good therapists don't necessarily do this. This is a thing that sometimes happens, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. But again, a vast majority of therapists do not accommodate kids' worries. They're not validating kids' worries. Abigail talks about CBT, saying that although a great many therapists claim to use CBT methods, a fraction of them are trained in its rigors or practicing its evidence-based methods. So it seems like she acknowledges that there are literally types of therapy designed to not accommodate kids' worries, designed to challenge, to push back on their worries. She just seems to think that CBT is the only good type of therapy, and that a fraction of therapists use it, and therefore a fraction of therapists are actually good therapists. Then she says bad therapy step 5 is to monitor the kids. And she says that parents these days just monitor their kids too much, they shield them from any sort of danger. I agree, I do agree to an extent, but what does this have to do with therapy? She doesn't even try to tie it into the topic of therapy. I couldn't even find the word therapy or therapist in this entire subchapter. Bad therapy step 6 is to dispense diagnoses liberally. I will say it again, this is indeed a problem, and it is a problem caused by insurances. If insurances didn't require people to have certain labels or diagnoses, then a majority of therapists would probably prefer to not diagnose at all. Bad therapy step 7 is to drug them. And again, I do agree that kids are being over-medicated today, but therapy does not equal psychiatry. Very few therapists actually have the right to prescribe medication. So again, what does this have to do with therapy? Bad therapy step 8, she says, is to encourage kids to share their trauma in quotation marks. Truly trauma-informed therapy never pushes people to disclose their traumas if they're not ready and if they don't want to. In fact, the only types of therapy that actually push people to disclose what happened to them are cognitive behavioral therapies, exposure therapies, as she just a few pages earlier talked about being the only really good type of therapy. Psychodynamic therapy, ACT, DBT, EMDR, brain spotting, somatic therapy, play therapy, none of these encourage kids to disclose their trauma. Encouraging kids to talk about what happened to them is not something that is happening commonplace. Even when assessing for something like in the home, therapists who are trauma-informed never ask leading questions because we know the power of suggestibility. Abigail doesn't seem to actually understand what happens in the therapy room and what the different types of therapy are. Bad therapy step 9, she says, is encourage young adults to break contact with toxic, again, air quotes, family. Again, therapists don't do this. The most a therapist will do is talk to a client who clearly seems on the fence about wanting to distance themselves from their family and help them make the right choice for themselves. Most therapists will never tell a client what to do with their life because they acknowledge that they don't actually know what's right for the client, only the client does. With that being said, are therapists going to support clients who want to distance themselves from abusive family members? Absolutely. Because bad therapy step 10 is to create treatment dependency. Again, therapists don't do this. Therapists are constantly trying to get their clients to graduate from therapy, to prepare them to be independent, plan around relapse prevention. And in most settings, therapists have way too many clients on their caseload. They're constantly trying to rotate them to get people to graduate. This is just not true. She talks about something called emotional hypochondriasis, and she says, is it possible that mental health experts are turning young people into emotional hypochondriacs? I do agree that there is a lot of self-diagnosing. There is a huge issue these days with Gen Z wanting to take on these labels themselves and then turning it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, this is something that I've talked about before, but it's not just happening in mental health care. With the advent of technology, people are going to their physicians also saying, oh, I think I know what I have, self-diagnosing despite the fact that they don't have any medical training. And it's not the therapist promoting this. Trust me, the therapists behind closed doors in the consultation room, group supervision room are complaining about this. We are trying to find a way to support clients while not validating self-diagnoses that don't seem to fit them. This is something that we're trying to combat just as much as anyone. And then she ends the chapter by saying, bad therapy today is practiced on almost every kid by therapists and just as often by non-therapists. And herein lies the issue. She cherry picks only the iatrogenic effects of therapy, not once mentioning the benefits that have been shown by study after study after study. She doesn't specify in what sorts of situations these iatrogenic effects come up, with what type of therapy, what type of therapist, what type of client. And instead, she just generalizes it to the field of therapy as a whole. She has succumbed to a lot of cognitive distortions and logical fallacies, including confirmation bias, overgeneralization, black and white thinking, straw man fallacies, and just generally arguing in bad faith. Chapter 4 is about what she calls social emotional meddling, which I guess is a learning technique called social emotional learning. I'm not a school therapist. I've actually never heard of social emotional learning, and so I don't have a lot of comments on this. I do think it's strange how problematic she finds perfectly innocuous school interventions to be, like giving people brain breaks, mindfulness minutes, ending each day with an optimistic closure. All of these are evidence-based interventions. We know that kids can only pay attention about twice their age in minutes. We also know that adults can't really pay attention for more than 45 minutes at a time, so what's the point of not having brain breaks? We know about the benefits of mindfulness, and we know from positive psychology about the benefits of optimism, so how is any of this bad? She talks about how terrible it is that school counselors and social workers are exerting undue influence over kids, and she wonders, are there any good school counselors? Again, showing that black and white thinking. And then she talks about some like group therapy style intervention that I guess is happening in schools. Again, I don't know about this. If you have kids, let me know if you've heard of this. But she talks about how kids start crying and say things like, I think my dad hates me and he yells at me all the time. Another kid talks about her parents getting divorced. Another one is worried about the man her mom is dating. All of these are examples of things that are very important for kids to talk about with other adults. A kid's dad yelling at him all the time and making him think that he hates him sounds like extreme cause for concern. A kid being worried about his mom's new partner is also extreme cause for concern. I'm not saying we need to catastrophize, jump to the worst case scenario, but these are very concerning things that adults should know about. She says that treating kids with in-school therapy can have all sort of iatrogenesis and makes dual relationships complicated. Again, what about the benefits? Again, this whole book focuses on the negative effects of therapy for kids. What about the fact that in-school therapy allows kids who otherwise don't have resources to have a place of support, or to identify kids who are being abused at home, or to catch mental health issues or risk before it escalates, possibly saving a kid's life, or just to provide emotional support. All of these are very substantial and very evidence-proven benefits of therapy, but Abigail somehow doesn't even touch on them. She also mentions that kids have something called a social emotional workbook, where they talk about all these emotional issues that come up, and she says try asking your kid's school for their social emotional workbook. Notice how hard it is to obtain a copy of one. Abigail, are you the type of parent that reads her kid's diary? Hi there, thanks so much for coming to the parent-teacher conference. Jimmy's been doing really well. He seems to really benefit from the brain breaks we do every 50 minutes. And he comes back a lot more refreshed, ready to focus. I'm sorry, what? What the hell is a brain break? Yeah, that's a break we take every 50 minutes, just to make sure that the kids are able to focus, since research shows that the average 8-year-old has the attention span of 16 minutes. Oh my god, how ridiculous. We didn't have brain breaks in my day and age. And we turned out fine. I mean, yes, I did block out age 8 to 16 and I still have nightmares about my dad yelling at me trying to study math, but we're fine. Don't you see how fine I am? Right, so I'm so glad that you turned out fine. But here at Generic Elementary School, we like to stick to what research has shown is good for kids, and so that's why we do things like brain breaks. So ridiculous. What other stuff are you putting in my child's head? Well, if you mean what else we do to make sure the kids are well adjusted, we do also have mindfulness moments at the end of each day. And we like to end with an optimistic closure moment. Since mindfulness has been shown to be beneficial for anxiety, stress, trauma, just generally getting mental chatter down. Are you implying my kid has anxiety and trauma? What? No? But whatever it is, I hope you just told him to shake it off. Just shake it off!
Shake it off? We never hear shake it off anymore.
Oh, is that why he keeps saying? I just thought he was a really big Taylor Swift fan. Also, where's my son's social emotional workbook? So typically, unless there's cause for concern, we don't have a policy of showing parents their social emotional workbooks, because what they write in there is supposed to be private, and so we just want to make sure that they can feel comfortable and safe writing whatever they'd like in there without fear of repercussion. Is there anything else you want to discuss today? No, I've heard enough. And just so you know, if he said anything about me in there, he's lying. I specifically did not call him a lying sack of shit weasels, okay? And chapter 5 doesn't really have a cohesive argument, but it kind of seems to be suggesting that schools coddle students. She talks about something called shadows, which is when schools send a person to sort of look after a student of concern. She also talks about how accommodations can kind of coddle students who don't need them and teach them that they don't still need to put in effort. And I kind of do agree with this. I remember in school there were definitely a lot of my peers that had accommodations that would even flat out tell me they didn't need them, or maybe those that did, that had social anxiety that would take accommodations to not speak up in class, for instance. And I also experienced social anxiety, and so that never quite sat right with me because I understood, having studied psychology, that the way to combat that is to do more of what scares you, not less of it. That being said, there are definitely kids that do need accommodations who have severe disabilities, but I do agree with her that accommodations culture is taken too far. She also talks about something called restorative justice, which she makes the case that actually hurts kids because the bully in school doesn't actually get any consequences and the victim of the bullying has to just sit there and accept their apology, which I can see that. I'm not super familiar with restorative justice in this context, but I can certainly see how that would be sort of victim blaming. She talks about how kids these days have temper tantrums all the time, how teachers are talking about how they've seen such a rise in this. I've also heard this from teachers, and I believe them that it is an issue that needs to be addressed. I don't quite know what to say about it aside from that. She says that childhood trauma is being used to justify behavior, which again, I have sort of seen this occasionally with people. I do think it's something we need to address. And she criticizes the ACE study, which, if you're not familiar, was a very groundbreaking study that showed that certain types of trauma can predispose people to greater amounts of health risks later on. Very well-respected, replicated study. Her gripe with it is that it's retrospective and not prospective, meaning you should be tracking people longitudinally as these things are happening, not just asking them to remember what happened to them when they were younger. And that is a valid criticism, but it's also worth mentioning that just because a study has methodological limitations doesn't mean it's worthless. The ACE study gave us a lot to learn about trauma. And even if it were a prospective study, it would still have its own methodological limitations that would need to be declared. Saying that a study has methodological limitations is not really the serve that she thinks it is.
Also, some of the replications of the ACE study have in fact been prospective, and they have confirmed associations between childhood adversity and negative life outcomes that were previously only done retrospectively. There is some evidence to suggest that certain personality styles may overestimate or underestimate things in a retrospective method, but it's disingenuous of Abigail to act like there haven't been prospective replications done that continue to reinforce the power of the original ACE study.
Then in chapter 6, she gives her thesis on how modern-day trauma specialists are basically quacks. She says that previous generations went through very traumatic things and seemed to be much more resilient. She completely misinterprets Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score. So for this sentence, she's quoting van der Kolk. She says, "What has happened cannot be undone," van der Kolk writes. This next sentence is not a quote from him. This is written by Abigail. "All you can do is work with a therapist to unearth and revisit your trauma." And this confused me, because when she's criticizing van der Kolk, she's making it seem like he's a big proponent of just talk therapy, revisiting your trauma in words, and that everybody who has trauma is basically doomed to have it stored in their body. And this was not at all the takeaway that I took from his book. He actually discussed being robbed at either gunpoint or knife point, I can't remember which one, and he talked about how he actually didn't develop a trauma reaction, and he theorized about why that might have been. And he very much promotes things like somatic approaches that don't rely on talking about the trauma, massage therapy, acupuncture, art therapy, psychodrama, receiving social and community support. So if anything, I would say that Bessel van der Kolk does not promote people just talking about their trauma. He very much promotes people physically getting out there and healing their trauma that way. She says there's no evidence that even survivors of the worst traumas hold memories implicitly, or that those memories can be stored outside of the central nervous system. His book is titled The Body Keeps the Score. The central nervous system is a part of the body. She criticizes his research. Again, she seems to think that if something has methodological limitations, if it's retrospective or correlational, it automatically has no value. Another shining example of black and white thinking. She seems to think that trauma therapists implant false memories in clients, and while there have definitely been cases of this, especially further back before we knew it was possible, current-day trauma-informed care never asks leading questions, even when assessing for abuse. just like I mentioned. And then she basically tries to character assassinate Dr. Nicole LaPera.
Apparently, Abigail takes issue with LaPera using a checklist-style structure in her videos, such as 9 signs your parents were emotionally immature.
As if the entire basis of diagnosing a disorder in someone isn't on criteria that are checked off a list. Checking criteria off a list is quite literally how you diagnose.
I find it funny that apparently this isn't the first time Abigail has tried to come after LaPera for something pretty minor. Back in 2022, Abigail took issue with LaPera stating that we shouldn't stigmatize divorce, stating that this is the mental health industry's typical view of divorce, a heroic act of self-love. Not a single qualm or caveat about the devastation it often visits on kids. Rest assured the therapists are quite ready to support children whose families are going through divorce and acknowledge the negative impact. Abigail seems to have this view that therapists are encouraging parents to take divorce lightly, which is not the case. The vast majority of parents do not divorce unless the consequences of staying in the marriage absolutely outweigh the pros, including for their children's well-being. And if divorce can reduce dysfunctional conflict, improve co-parenting, model healthy relationship termination, I'm willing to bet those kids are better off than if they had stayed in an extremely toxic household with both parents.
Then in chapter 7, she talks about her issue with giving kids questionnaires about their mental health. And some of these questionnaires, again, I will say they're very leading in a negative way. I don't know who approved them, but some of them are really not. For instance, this one. I can tell my parents the way I feel about things. I like to do things with my family. I usually have dinner with my family. I feel close with my family. I spend time with my family doing things like shopping, playing sports, or working on school projects. My parents notice when I do a good job and let me know. Besides my family, there is an adult who I can trust. Important people in my life often let me down. I'm sorry, what's the issue here? Seems to be assessing for empathic attunement and neglect and social support in the home. Why is that bad? There seems to be something very hush-hush about her attitude on kids taking mental health questionnaires. Something very private about it, that like kids shouldn't be talking about what's happening in the home, which is very sus to me. And she acknowledges that there are some questions that if a student says yes on, might prompt a call to child services. And this is a bad thing? It's a bad thing to investigate whether kids are getting abused or neglected. Abigail seems to be under the impression that kids these days are just cutting off their family members willy-nilly. She says, we have a surprising number of young people deciding they were profoundly neglected or emotionally abused, cutting off contact with loving parents in startling numbers. I'm sorry. No child, adult or otherwise, cuts off contact with a parent unless they have absolutely reached a breaking point. In fact, in my work with clients who experienced abusive parents, I can't think of a single person that actually cut off their parents. I can't think of a single person who even considered it. Things have to get so bad for somebody to finally say, I cannot have this person in my life. We are biologically determined to latch to our parents, to want to be around them. And that doesn't happen when a child says, I cannot be around this person, they are too harmful for me. It is because they have done everything that they can possibly do. They understand that the rest is kind of within the other person's control, and they have no reason to believe that things are ever going to get better. Clients are very ambivalent about cutting off their parents. They are not cutting off people that do not need to be cut off. Look, maybe there are exceptions. I'm sure there's maybe, somebody with a personality disorder here and there that does do this, but it is very much the exception rather than the norm. And this is the part that I found to be so hilarious. She finds issue with asking kids, how are you feeling today? This sort of contemplation is inherently destabilizing. Is this a joke? Genuinely, is this a joke? Am I being pranked right now? In chapter 8, she criticizes empathy culture, and I do agree that empathy for the in-group always has a shadow side, but it's not really the issue with empathy, it's a problem with identification. Let me explain what I mean. Empathy research has shown us that you can prime somebody to have more or less empathy for another person based on how much they identify with them. For instance, if you get somebody to talk about how much they love soccer, and then they see somebody walking by on the street falling down who's wearing a soccer t-shirt, or jersey, I don't know what they're called. Okay, I don't know. They're more likely to help them because they just thought about how they identify with them, how they belong to the same group. Versus if you get someone to reflect on their specific soccer team and they see somebody falling down who's wearing a different soccer team shirt, they're not as likely to help that person because it's a matter of identification, not just empathy. We can theoretically empathize with anybody. We can see the humanity in anybody, and we can even see the just value in non-human creatures and objects also. We can empathize with anything in this world. The issue is over-identifying with an in-group. I really fail to see how this chapter is related to therapy at all. I don't really know. Maybe she needed to reach a word count or something. In chapter 9, she criticizes gentle parenting. She basically conflates it with permissive parenting. Now, if you're not familiar, these are the different general parenting styles. And authoritative parenting has been shown to be the most beneficial one. When the parent is in charge, they set the rules, but they're not overly authoritarian about it. They're not like a tyrant. They do let the kid have some say in their own autonomy. So in this chapter, she says some kind of weird things, which at this point shouldn't be very surprising. She said that her generation was spanked as kids, but suddenly they felt ashamed as if it was abuse, which technically the CPS definition of child abuse does not include spanking unless it leaves some kind of mark or unless it's done with a different object. But that doesn't mean that spanking's not abuse. And the way I like to think of it is, would you ever think it's okay to touch another adult against their consent? To hit them in some way? No, of course not. That would be illegal. That would be wrong. It would be immoral. So why the fuck would it be okay to do to a small, helpless child who has already so much less power than you, who's already learning about the way that the world works and is going to internalize the idea that the way the world works is sometimes people are going to be violent to you against your consent? Well, Abigail says, in addition to being spanked, her generation was also yelled at and punished, but now that seems off limits with her own. Is that something that you lament? She takes issue with therapists telling parents what to do, even a childless one in her words, which again doesn't surprise me whatsoever because I have colleagues that are child therapists and they get a lot of questions from parents who want to know if they have children. And the way that I think about this is you don't need to be a parent to be a child therapist because your job is not to relate to the parent. Your job is to relate to the child. Now, if you're dealing with parenting issues, that I can kind of understand wanting to have a therapist who is also a parent because you maybe want them to have the same lived experience as you. You want them to be able to empathize you with, which by the way, they don't have to have been through the same experiences to empathize with their client. But that I understand a little bit more. When people say they won't listen to therapists unless they have kids of their own, that to me sounds more like I want my kid's therapist to validate me. I want my kid's therapist to understand me, to cut me some slack. When in reality, your kid is not in therapy so that you can get some slack. Your kid is in therapy to get the help they need. She says, tongue-in-cheek, but her therapist knows all about mental health. She therefore must know more about parenting than the people who've actually done it, which is a little like soliciting the advice of a biologist on how to make love. How do you figure? Wouldn't it be more like soliciting the advice of a biologist on biology, soliciting the advice of a mechanic for your car, or soliciting the advice of a physician about your health? And then she does exactly what she accused others of doing earlier in the book, which is retroactively inferring causality. She, on one hand, conflates permissive parenting with gentle parenting, and by the way, they are not the same thing. And while doing that, she's also assuming that gentle parenting is what led to kids these days being disrespectful. I completely agree that permissive parenting is a problem. I also think that when people say gentle parenting is like permissive parenting, they don't actually understand what gentle parenting is. Gentle parenting, from what I understand, is just being gentle with your kids, not yelling at them, listening to how they're feeling, validating their emotions, considering their autonomy. If a parent says you should always listen to your kid and what they want and not set any rules, that's not gentle parenting, that's permissive parenting. Now, we're kind of getting caught up in what's what are the definitions. What matters is not what people call themselves, it's what they're doing. If somebody is being a permissive parent, then we know that's one of the worst parenting styles to be for your kids long term. But if they're being a gentle parent, there's nothing wrong with that. She claims that mental health experts think parents are morons. She says pediatricians tell them what kids need from them emotionally. School psychologists tell them how to talk about hard stuff. No one solicits parents' advice because our advice is non-expert and therefore presumably without worth. No, it's not without worth. You know your kids better than anybody else. You have the best insight on them, on your specific relationship, on their needs. But while you are the expert on your particular child, having a child does not make you an expert on parenting. Decades of research have been done on this topic. Those are the people that are the experts on this topic. topic. Abigail says that it's wrong for therapists to think that the goal of parenting is emotional wellness of their children. I'm a little bit confused by that because most parents I know, their top priority is for their kids to be emotionally well, so I've never heard somebody claim that that's not a priority for them. But even if it's, let's say values alignment, let's say you want your kid to have very sure values and to live in alignment with them. Let's say that that is your top priority. Therapy also does that. Therapies like ACT, for instance, are very focused on what are your values? How can we help you live according to them? She claims that therapists are pulling a bait and switch, that basically therapists are conflating authoritative and authoritarian parenting. The therapists are saying parents shouldn't be authoritarian, but really they're discouraging parents from being authoritative. And again, this is just not the case. Therapists are always promoting boundaries with kids, always promoting for the parent to be the one in charge, to not parentify the kids. So if anything, she's the one conflating permissive and gentle parenting. At one point, I thought this was interesting. She said, what actually makes miserable kids is placing them in charge. She's describing parentification, which just pages ago she was defending when she said that her family parentified her and their generation turned out fine. There are just so many inconsistencies in this book, so many logical loops and hypocrisies where she'll twist things to fit her narrative and then she'll go ahead and do exactly what she's criticizing parents and therapists of doing. She said she decided to talk to parents who actually raised healthy, productive children, and then most of them turned out to be immigrants. As an immigrant myself, as somebody who has worked as a therapist for adult immigrant children, I promise you, immigrant children also face serious issues. Immigrant children often have issues of their own, and they might end up being very successful professionally, academically. It might look on paper like their life is all figured out, but behind the scenes, immigrant children also have a lot of emotional issues that are unresolved. That's why there are even therapists out there that specialize in adult immigrant children, because it has its own set of issues. And I don't particularly like being used as a pawn in a talking point when in reality, what you're saying doesn't speak from my experience at all. The point she seems to be making is that immigrant parents do a better job of instilling values in their children. Because she says the problem with American parenting is we don't assert authority with our own children. We don't pass our values down to our kids. Force-feeding your values to your kids will never work, no matter how hard you try. It doesn't work with immigrant children either. Values are intensely personal. One person could, for instance, decide to be a doctor because they want to be financially secure. Another person could decide to be a doctor because they want to help people. Two people who seem like they've taken the same exact path, and yet their values are completely different. What's driving them at their core is completely different. There is absolutely no way to force somebody to have your specific values because it's something so deeply personal. If you think that anybody is successful at ingraining a specific value in their kid, it's not possible. The kid is making the decision to absorb that value. That's what's happening. Then in chapter 10, she says that we over-medicate kids. And I do agree with this. Like I said, I think we do have an over-medication problem for kids and adults. But the person she interviews for this has a very fringe belief. She interviews somebody in Israel named Ophir, who found out that his boy was diagnosed with ADHD. And the more he started learning about ADHD, the more he was convinced that it isn't actually a disorder. Because according to him, it doesn't have the 4 Ds of abnormal psychology: deviance, distress, dysfunction, or danger. Kids with ADHD do experience distress about it. I have worked with clients with ADHD who are deeply distressed about what it's like to be in their mind and what it's like to not be able to accomplish the things that they want to do. Dysfunction is also an issue because they struggle to perform academically, occupationally, socially. The issue isn't that ADHD just doesn't exist. The issue is that we're over-diagnosing it. So instead of 15% of kids actually having ADHD, it's probably closer to the prevalence of other disorders like 1 to 4%. At one point she actually says that ADHD doesn't cause distress in the child. Are you kidding me? Of course it does. And this Ophir that she interviewed claims that a real disorder interferes with the ability to lead a normal life, but there are plenty of jobs in which people don't have to just sit still, and because of that, it's not impairing their life. That doesn't make any sense. The child setting is their current environment, not a potential job that they could have in 10 years. And all settings, even the ones that might be more high energy and non-traditional, require people to occasionally sit still and pay attention. And then the last few chapters are about how Abigail thinks kids these days don't need therapy. And she gives the example of something called the Latino paradox, which is the finding that immigrants from Latin American cultures, particularly Mexico, fare better in the US than any other demographic, except once they get more acculturated to American culture.
Why are Latinos, why do they have better mental health when they come to this country, when they are immigrants, before they assimilate? And the more they acculturate to American culture, the worse their mental health gets. Why?
I don't know.
Part of the reason is they have social stability in their relational. They are surrounded by extended family, which also means people are saying the wrong things to them. They're saying insulting things. They're making inappropriate jokes. They're giving them foods mom doesn't approve of. And they're surviving it all. And they know they can.
But does the Latino paradox actually reflect what she says it does? One study found that Mexican immigrants reported they're better off because they have an opportunity to earn a good living, a trustworthy legal system, good healthcare, and good education system. Compared to Mexico, that's the way that they perceive things. Another study found that familism and being bilingual were associated with higher levels of life satisfaction. Protective factors such as strong family and community ties are suspected to be the reason why Latinos have better life satisfaction. But what Abigail does in her book is she essentially equates having strong ties to your family with invalidation.
They are surrounded by extended family, which also means people are saying the wrong things to them. They're saying insulting things. They're making inappropriate jokes. They're giving them foods mom doesn't approve of.
And she somehow connects that to bad therapists, because bad therapists are, as we saw, in Abigail's mind, encouraging people to cut off their family members. But if it were true that strong family ties are the only thing protecting younger generations from mental illness, we would expect to see this in any sort of collectivistic culture that people are immigrating from, which is not the case for other collectivistic cultures such as East Asian, African, Eastern European. In fact, East Asian immigrants, who are arguably the most collectivistic culture, are actually some of the least happy immigrants in the US. And having worked with some of these individuals myself, I can tell you that it's not just about having strong social ties or having a collectivistic culture where you're valuing the collective, not just your own feelings. What matters to people is being emotionally safe with their families. If they don't feel emotionally safe with their families, then it doesn't matter how close they are, they're not going to be better off because of it. So it doesn't seem like collectivism is the only thing explaining the Latino paradox. And then she basically ends the book by saying that mental health experts need to stay out of parents' business. So that was definitely the longest summary I've ever done. Let's move on to what I agreed with, what I disagreed with, and why I thought this book was incredibly dishonest. I actually do agree with a lot of the points that she raised. I do think that kids and parents alike are over-pathologized in this day and age and over-diagnosed with mental illness. And again, I do think that insurance is in large part to blame for this, because therapists and clients alike just want to make sure that the care is covered. And a lot of therapists would prefer not to diagnose mental illness if they had the choice because of things like self-fulfilling prophecies or just the futility of it. You treat the person, not the disorder. So it's not like therapists want to diagnose everybody. It's the insurances, I promise you. However, while not everything merits a diagnosis, that doesn't mean that therapy can't be helpful for people that don't have a mental illness as well. Like I said, wellness is more than just an absence of disease. And there are a lot of therapies out there that focus on this, that focus on improving a person's life, not just decreasing symptoms. Therapy can look very different for somebody that has mental illness versus somebody that's healthy and just has a goal that they want to work on. If somebody walks in and they're healthy, we're not just going to diagnose them willy-nilly. Therapists consult a lot about making accurate diagnoses. Another thing that I did agree with her on is that there is absolutely a social contagion going on with mental illness in this day and age, and anyone who speaks out about it, even therapists, can pretty much expect to be canceled for it, because if you so much as suggest that, hey, maybe you shouldn't self-diagnose off of TikTok with ADHD or autism or tic disorder, people say that you're gatekeeping. People say that you are invalidating their experience, even though they don't actually have the qualifications to diagnose a person. With that being said, social contagion and mass hysteria are nothing new. This isn't something that just cropped up recently because of therapists. From as far back as like the witch trials, the satanic panic, it's always popular for older generations to fearmonger about the path that younger generations are going down. But in the end, each generation turns out fine, and all the fearmongering turned out to be unnecessary and kind of nearsighted. I do agree with her also that we have given this new generation an external locus of control, low self-efficacy, pessimism, and a culture of victimhood that overall lowers resilience. Because there is so much of a focus on the things outside of our control and validating that people have been harmed by systemic forces, younger generations truly believe that they can't affect change in their lives, and that is a very dangerous thing. But this is not due to therapy. This is due to ideology, and ideology often, yes, infiltrates therapeutic spaces. It infiltrates the schools, the institutions, the practices themselves. If that's the case, we need to address the ideology, not the therapy. I did find it interesting that at one point in this book, she talked about how liberal kids and teens tend to struggle more with mental illness than conservative ones, because I do think it has to do with what I just mentioned. In this very far left ideology, there tends to be a lot of focus on the way people and society has done you wrong. Whereas with conservatives, it's just not as much of that. I do also agree with her that not all adversity is trauma. Adversity can indeed build resilience. And anytime I discuss resilience on this channel or the importance of not falling to a victim mindset, people get very angry. People think that teaching how to be more resilient is invalidating of their trauma, and it's really not an either or thing. Either I'm a victim or I'm resilient. You can be both. You can have experienced trauma and have it validated and share your feelings about it, and also choose to move forward. I did agree with her that some of the questionnaires were overly leading with very negative items that are probably going to prime the person taking that questionnaire to give more negative answers. And I do agree that sometimes schools go overboard with accommodations, and it turns out, ironically, making it less of a fair playing field, because it's not a matter of the kids who actually need it getting accommodations, but rather the kids that actually want accommodations getting it. All that being said, there was a lot that I disagreed with too. I completely disagree that therapy is only for severe issues. In reality, everybody could use therapy at least every now and then, a little checkup when they feel like they need it. Just like you go to a physician once a year, maybe you don't go to a therapist once a year, but maybe the equivalent is you go to a therapist when you're struggling emotionally. You go to a therapist when you need it. And targeting people in the prevention stage is going to be more convenient, cheaper, and just better and easier for everybody involved. Also, the majority of the steps of bad therapy that she gave are just not typical of modern day therapy. Some of them weren't even related to therapy. They were clearly written by somebody who has very little familiarity with psychotherapy. And I know she said she's been to therapists, but she clearly doesn't understand what the different types of therapy are and how they work. Probably the biggest thing that I disagreed with her on is the idea that invalidation and encouraging emotion suppression is a healthy way to raise kids. It is never healthy to suppress your emotions. We have extensive research into this topic. You can absolutely validate a child's right to have an emotion, even while you're challenging whether it's okay to feel in that specific instance. For example, you can say, I understand you're frustrated with me for not letting you play on my phone right now. Unfortunately, this is the rule, and sometimes when we don't like rules, it can be frustrating. Doesn't mean the rule's changing. The underlying message in something like that would be, hey, it's okay that you feel mad. I'm not gonna be upset with you that you are having an emotional reaction. Just know that this doesn't mean that the rules are going to change. I really like DBT's flowchart for dealing with an emotion, where you identify what's the emotion you're feeling and you assess, does the emotion fit the facts and is it effective to act upon it? Does the emotion fit the facts is essentially a way of assessing, is it valid to feel in this moment? But again, you validate a person's right to feel that emotion, even if you challenge whether it makes sense in that situation. Once again, when it comes to painful emotions, it's not a matter of either moving forward or validating. It's a matter of both. We have to both acknowledge our painful emotions and find a way to move forward from them. Abigail's claim that we just need to suppress our emotions and shake it off is just as harmful as therapists who claim that we need to wallow in the past forever without ever moving on. Of course, it should be no surprise at this point, but I think she blames therapists for Gen Z's rise in mental illness, and her evidence for inferring this causality is weak, cherry-picked, largely anecdotal. Gentle parenting does not equal permissive parenting. And I also disagree with how she thinks having kids makes her more of an expert on parenting than people who have dedicated decades of their life to this. Now, why I think this book was intellectually dishonest. Again, she inferred causality between Gen Z is mentally ill and Gen Z is seeking therapy more than ever. The way that she sees it is therapy's causing the mental illness. I don't think I need to explain the very basic concept that correlation does not equal causation, since Abigail herself takes issue with correlational studies like the ACE study for this very reason. There probably are a lot of systemic variables at play, such as economic or political instability, social media. Abigail herself acknowledges some of them, though she makes the implication that therapists are to blame for even all of those. It's a very circular logic, like kids these days are more mentally ill than they've ever been, and that's because kids these days are going to therapy when they don't need it and they're having the iatrogenic effects of it. Well, if they're mentally ill, how are they too healthy for therapy? If they're mentally ill before ever stepping foot in a therapist's office, how was it the therapist who created the mental illness? She seems to know very little about how therapy actually works. She seems to think that all trauma therapy is exposure therapy, ignoring the fact that plenty of trauma therapies don't actually involve talking about it, like EMDR, somatic, brain spotting, some of which are promoted in the very books that she criticizes because she thinks that those books promote just talking about your trauma. She thought that it was just one psychologist who mentions the risks of therapy in his waiver, meaning the informed consent. She praises CBT in some parts, saying that exposure therapy is the only way to treat anxiety, while in other parts condemning exposure therapy for trauma. She really doesn't seem to understand the different theoretical orientations of therapy, what they entail, what sorts of presenting concerns they are and aren't used for. For example, she praises DBT in a couple of parts, which, I love DBT. But it goes against the very type of invalidation that she promotes in her book. In fact, Marsha Linehan, the creator of DBT, is the one who came up with the biosocial theory of borderline personality disorder, which says that borderline personality disorder develops when an invalidating environment is paired with a genetic predisposition for emotion dysregulation. I do not think that Marsha Linehan would be down for the kind of invalidation that she promotes in this book of just shake it off or get over it. Psychologists actually do tons of research to make sure that the treatments they provide are evidence-based and effective. And the fact that she doesn't know about it just shows she's uninformed about the topic, which is fine. You don't have to be super informed about the topic. But if you're not informed about it, why write a book on it? And in general, she just only sought out information that confirmed her narrative. Despite the fact that she mentioned she's interviewed hundreds of psychologists for the making of this book, the only ones that actually made it in the book were the ones that said what she believed, like Jordan Peterson, or the ones that she wanted to character assassinate, like Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Is that how you say his name? Gabor Mate? Gabor Mate? And probably the biggest issue with this book is just the sweeping generalizations that it makes. She presents the iatrogenic effects of therapy as an indication of something wrong with the entire field. She doesn't seem to know much about the different theoretical orientations within it. Instead, lumping us all into one, she claims several times that she's not against therapy for people who really need it, and yet on the very last page of her book she says this: remove the spoons, the technology, the hovering, blah blah blah, the expert evaluations. You don't need them, you never needed them, and your kids are almost certainly better off without them. Or how from the synopsis itself, she says it's the mental health experts that are to blame. In another spot she says, today's mental health experts ought to take a hard look at all of their advice and consider the possibility that much of it is dead wrong. She takes a gripe that she has with a very small proportion of therapists, and she generalizes all therapists as having it. I'd actually have very little issue with this book if instead the thesis were, I personally take issue with some of the mainstream tenets of modern therapy, and this is why. But the way that it's written provides little nuance, explores only the evidence that supports her viewpoint, not the actual nuanced research on this topic. And she takes her points too far, being too black and white in her thinking, all the while claiming that she's being nuanced. It's tough because while I do agree with her on some of the things she mentioned, the biased tone and the logical inconsistencies make it very hard to rate this anything other than 1 star. She's also super hypocritical in it. She criticizes trauma therapists for retroactively inferring causality between trauma and mental health struggles. But she herself retroactively infers causality between gentle parenting and misbehavior, between mental illness and going to therapy. She criticizes parentification in one breath and then idealizes it in another by saying, oh, the good old days when we were just neglected. She criticizes groundbreaking correlational research in the field of psychology yet she has no issue relying on correlational research for her claims, like the Latino paradox. She conflates terms when it's convenient for her, like conflating gentle and permissive parenting, conflating the support that Latino families have with letting families say all the wrong things. Some of the references are misleading. Some of her metaphors are misleading, like she'll say something is like something else, and yet when you actually look at it at face value, it doesn't make any sense. Like when she said that offering seminars about responsible social media use is like drug counselors lecturing on the appropriate use of ecstasy. All in all, this book feels very biased in the way that it's presented, which leads me to wonder what would motivate somebody to write a book like this. Obviously, I don't know Abigail personally, I've never met her, but if somebody came up to me and they started saying that all therapists are making kids mentally ill and the good old days when we just invalidated people were so much better, I'd have two theories about that person. One would be that person might be trying very hard to defend against feelings of their own painful childhood. The second theory would be this person might have been told that their own kids struggle emotionally and are trying to defend against feelings of pain or guilt about that. Or maybe she just wants the money. I don't know. If you have watched this far in the video, my God, I appreciate you. Thank you so very much. This is definitely the longest video I've ever filmed, and it literally feels like my brain is about to break in half. So thank you again. If you could, give this video a like, comment your thoughts. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'll see you next time.